Hi everyone, Seagull here, coming to you again from my home office. I hope that this week's review finds you still in good health and in good spirits and having screened Maktub, which I'm going to coin a modern day Israeli fairy tale. I chose this film just because I thought it was going to be a little bit lighter. As we get ready to celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut, I figured we would do something a little less serious and a little bit more fun. And I'm happy to report, in my opinion, that Maktub did not disappoint. It is a film directed by Oded Raz, but it features two really popular Israeli comedians who work together beautifully, Hanan Savion and Guy Amir. The film Maktub's name actually means it is written or fate in Arabic. So for those of us Yiddish people, Gishribbon or Beshert would have been an equally good name, but I think that they chose the Arabic term very purposefully, which I'll get to a little bit later. Basically, the story is a very dark comedy featuring these two Israeli comedians, Hanan Savion and Guy Amir, who play two low-level Israeli mobsters who are tasked to go out on behalf of their boss. They ride around collecting protection money from various restaurants and other businesses. And in addition, the two of them happen to also be foodies. And so the beginning of the movie, we come upon them giving advice to a restaurateur who you can tell immediately is really uncomfortable sitting at the table with these two, because they're not just there to give him aids about his menu, but they're there to collect protection money, and he knows that his new chef is not interested in paying. The film definitely has a lot of dark humor in it, and also meddled in with some unfortunately very violent scenes, but I think the film is done respectfully in that it's not overly gory, but you do need that sort of violent undertone, I think, to set the stage for the humor that follows. Basically, in terms of plot, and the reason why this film is called Maktub or Fate is that these two mobsters find themselves in the middle of a restaurant. It's their second stop of the day. After they started in the original place where they were giving aids to the guy who has a new chef who doesn't want to pay. They unfortunately beat the chef to a pulp, and then ensues an argument on whether or not the stain on Steve's shirt is pomegranate juice or blood. And while they're having this argument, they make their way into this second stop. And sadly, the restaurant is the product of a pigua, or a terrorist attack. The two of them, for some unknown reason, survive the attack, while everyone else in the restaurant, including their muscle guy, who finishes his shift and announces to them that he's finished his shift and is very hungry and comes into the restaurant to eat. Everyone dies except for these two mobsters, and they make away with the briefcase full of protection money that belongs to their boss. They decide that since they weren't killed in the pigua along with everybody else, that they really have an opportunity to change their lives. Steve, the more pragmatic mobster type, he decides that this money is going to be used for them to leave Israel, come to America, and start a fish kebab food truck business, while his partner Chuma, he's kind of the moral compass of the two. He decides that it's a sign that they didn't just survive for no reason. Not only is it a sign, but they have to go and put a petek into the kotel and pray as a sign of their devotion to God for having spared them. And while they're at the kotel, Chuma pulls out a petek and decides that this should be their new calling. With all this added cash at their disposal, instead of the life of crime that they had been immersed in up until this point, they should leave all of that behind and instead start fulfilling the wishes of various people who have left these notes in the kotel. Of course, the comedy that ensues after that is really, in my opinion, extremely, extremely Israeli in nature and very enjoyable to watch, as they scheme and change the lives of three people throughout the course of the film. Um, the violence that you see in terms of the pigua, and of course the nuance of the violence of them having to do their job as mobsters, was handled very tastefully, but again, I think meant to really show the viewership um, what Israelis, I think, live with on a day-to-day that is difficult for us as North Americans to understand, but to them is as routine as stopping at Tim Hortons on a Monday morning to grab a cup of coffee might be to us. In particular, there's one scene which is very, very salient right after the pigua, and the fake eye of the muscle guy goes flying, and the kids on the street find it, and they just begin playing with it like a very special heaven-sent marble, which in fact turns into a subject of a kerfuffle between the kids later on in the film, but I don't want to ruin everything for you if you haven't seen it up until now. I think that, you know, this was really important for the film to include these kinds of things, because it is, after all, an Israeli film meant to relate to Israelis, but I think also to show and illustrate some of the difficulties of Israeli life to those viewers who might be watching from outside of Israel. And I think that the film did a really, really great job of sharing that with us. Just a little bit of information about the two comedic stars, Guy Amir and Hanan Savian. As I said at the beginning, this was a move for them from television into full film. They have a really, really, really incredible career and great chemistry, which, you know, made the roles, I think, pop off the screen in Maktub. They have all kinds of amazing, amazing shows. They've got 7 different popular series viewed over 80 million times in Israel and outside. Some of the more notable series that you may want to check out, Asfour, which is again an Arabic title meaning lucky bird. It's about 4 guys who are living in a farm in the center of Jerusalem on an extremely expensive parcel of land, and they find themselves in debt of $55,000 to the city. They can't afford it, and they have to figure out a way to get this money or lose the land to the highest bidder. A very, very highly acclaimed comedy series in Israel. Another one is Chateau Ein Karem, again, in an offshoot area of Jerusalem called Ein Karem. The two play a pair of unsuccessful brothers who are trying to manage a boutique hotel in Jerusalem, not well, apparently. And also a really critically acclaimed drama called Pitzuim Barosh, which was then translated into Scarred, worth checking out as a drama that comes out of these two. In terms of the reviews that I read online, I brought you a few in the source sheets that are accompanying my video. Forbes gave it a big thumbs up, basically drawing attention to the incredible chemistry between these two actors, and you know, just a feel-good story around the idea of changing other people's fate to change their fate from transitioning from mobsters to better people. The Daily Dot also gave it a really big thumbs up. They really drew a lot of attention to the mixture of genres, which I also felt was expertly done in this film. You had everything from thriller, a little bit dark comedy, and even some very, you know, touching drama pieces, especially in the romantic relationships that you have between both protagonists and the women that come into their lives. As I already mentioned, you've got the two of them playing incredibly well against each other, with Chuma playing the role of the moral compass and Steve playing, you know, the role of the macho guy who, you know, really needs to put a distance between himself and his past, which we only come to realize as we continue to watch the film. And of course, the beauty of that feel-good storyline of them helping the people along the way in the film. Um, just like a fairy tale, not that I'm suggesting this would be appropriate to read as a bedtime story to kids, but just as a fairy tale has, and they lived happily ever after, you're not sure where all these stories are going within this film, but they do get connected in a nice, neat, tied up in a little bow at the end of the film, with this really feel-good, happily ever after ending. I'm not going to spoil it just in case you haven't heeded my advice and you're watching me before the film. I gave it a huge thumbs up. I found it a completely enjoyable way to spend a bit of time. And, you know, in the past, I've kind of found Israeli comedy to be a bit of a hit and miss situation. Sometimes it's a little too dark for me. Sometimes I feel like because I'm not an Israeli, although I'm a daughter of an Israeli, sometimes I feel like the humor is missed on me because I'm missing some of the nuance. But in this case, this was just a feel-good, enjoyable movie that I would highly recommend that you stream if you haven't done so already. In terms of source sheets that I gave you, in terms of learning to accompany and themes that came out of the film for me. So first of all, you know, there's this whole question of, do you have a fate? Is destiny at the root of everything going on with our lives? Are we merely puppets playing a role by a puppeteer? So this whole idea of fate and destiny in the Jewish religion, I thought would be an interesting topic to explore. So I created one source sheet for you devoted to that discussion. You've got a couple of sources there that I'm hoping you'll find informative. One comes at you from Chabad, where in this article by Chabad, they focus on Joseph's story as a way to peel back the layers of the question of fate and destiny. You know, the question is, was it Joseph's character traits that put this plan in motion, and was it the divine plan that had to be put out into motion by Joseph's character flaws? How does that all play into the idea of, are we the masters of our own fate, or are we destined to just merely, you know, act out a story that was already pre-written for us? A really interesting read out of Chabad. Then two articles out of My Jewish Learning. The first one, again, centered around the idea of destiny versus fate, where they unpack the story of Rivka and Yaakov and how they change Yaakov's fate. You know, of course, the very famous story of the two twins, Esav and Yaakov, the Esav being the firstborn and having the right of the blessing of the firstborn, and how it's quote unquote stolen by Yaakov, and of course manipulated by Rivka. Pretty much any great story, in my opinion, biblical or otherwise, that had some sort of planning and really active heroism. If you look closely, probably you're going to find a strong woman at play there. So My Jewish Learning focuses on Rebecca and Jacob. Another one from My Jewish Learning called A Devar for the Road brings up a really, really interesting idea, in my opinion, that these two things are not mutually exclusive of one another, that in fact, you can be on a path that was designed or predetermined for you, but how you walk that path is totally up to you. A beautiful article that I would highly recommend not to miss, cites all kinds of interesting examples from Moshe to Esther and Mordechai, the story of Purim, just saying, another heroine there at the core. And another really, really complicated but very interesting article out of Arutz Sheva, which basically gives you an article by the Reb Soloveitchik, who talks about Jews in diaspora and Jews in Israel, both living very different lives. Jews of fate or Jews of destiny. A really, really complicated read, but very, very interesting. And certainly if you guys have further questions that you want to discuss about that article, I'd be very happy to do so. You can always email me, or you can post on our Facebook discussion group and see what others have to say about your thoughts on that article. So that's the first source sheet, called Fate versus Destiny. The second one that I put together is called Reviews and News. So it gives you a few of the review sites that I mentioned in my video, where the professionals reviewed the film. I wasn't able to find any negative reviews, although some of them did say that the film, was a little surface, if you will. But I think any good comedy really doesn't have to delve into those serious thinking spaces. But I would argue that this film had a lot to offer, despite the fact that it was a comedy. So you've got those three review sources there. In addition, I gave you some interesting things that came up around the Kotel, since this story is based on pulling out takim, or pulling out notes from the Wailing Wall, from the Western Wall, from the Kotel. So I wanted to bring you some interesting things where the Kotel has appeared in the news of late. You've got everything from presidential visits from Obama and Donald Trump. Apparently, whether you love him or don't, Donald Trump's visit to the Kotel really did enamor him in the eyes of the Israeli population, which I thought was a very interesting read. And something that I didn't know, that when Obama went, and he too put a note into the Wailing Wall, it was subsequently removed and then published, which created a whole hoo-ha, because not only was it not something that was meant to be removed, but the fact that it was published was considered to be a big, big, big no-no. Sharing someone's private thoughts like that. So an interesting article there. Also, an article about the recently approved plan to approve the rapid transit line between Ben Gurion and Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and to extend that into a stop that would actually take people from Ben Gurion straight to the Kotel. A really interesting read about that project, as well as the fact that the egalitarian section, for those of you who don't know, there was a woman praying there, and a boulder fell out of that section of the wall and missed her, but did, of course, shake her up. And then ensued a repair job that took more than 2 years to reach its final completion. Of course, there's all kinds of articles. I didn't include them for you, but you can look them up for yourself about whether or not the process took longer than it should, took as much as it should. In any event, the work is finally completed to that egalitarian section of the Kotel. And of course, I wanted to give you a little bit of information about this whole tradition of leaving notes in the wall and what happens to them. For those of you who weren't in the know, including myself, I figured that the notes at some point had to be removed, because with the millions of people who come from all walks of life, from places all around the planet to the Kotel, and putting those notes in the wall, there wouldn't be place to keep them all. So eventually someone had to come along and remove them. What I didn't know is that, in fact, this happens at two pre-prescribed times of the year, one right before Rosh Hashanah, and again, one right before Pesach. The notes are treated like a Torah scroll and cannot just be thrown away, but rather are set aside for Geniza or for burial like any sacred text. It's handled with a great deal of care and concern. And of course, I would have been remiss if I didn't go in to further examination of what's going on around the Kotel and how it's been impacted by our current situation around the globe with the coronavirus. I gave you all kinds of articles that show everything from how this removal of the notes this time around had to be done by people in hazmat suits, lahavdil, with the usual stick and glove and geniza. It's still going into the Geniza, but in fact, the men wearing hazmat suits had to remove it. And in fact, the Wailing Wall had to be sanitized toward the spread of coronavirus off. In addition, there were all kinds of rules and regulations, of course, around gathering. And of course, no more than 10 people are able to gather at the Kotel for the time being. And in addition, decrees about not kissing the stones in an effort to curb and flatten the curve of the spread of the coronavirus. And of course, I wanted to give you some really uplifting articles about some incredible services that were held in the tunnels at the Kotel and have been streamed by millions of viewers around the world in these difficult times. In addition, at the end of the source sheet, you also have the site for the Western Wall source, where you can actually live stream stuff from the Kotel if you would like to do so. So for me, another week here at home, working away. I hope I hope that you enjoyed this film as much as I did. Not only was it a feel good, but it was another opportunity to learn. And more than that, you know, the fact that they called it Maktub, I think, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, was extremely purposeful. Again, you know, this tension between the Arab and Israeli populations, the interplay of those two cultures and how they do beautifully mesh in many occasions, one into the other. Uh, the you know, just the pure delicious Israeliness of this film I found to be really, really enjoyable, from these two foodie mobsters to the beautiful happy ending that just made for a really good feel good way to end a couple of hours in front of a Netflix film. So for me to you, I wish you continued good health. Stay healthy, stay safe, stay positive as much as you can, and I look forward to seeing you again next week. Happy streaming.